Hello everyone, welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Charles Godfray, I'm the director, and it's great pleasure to welcome you here to a talk that's going to be given by our guest, Warren East. And Warren is an alumnus of this university. He was at Wadham, has had an extraordinarily distinguished career in the private sector, including being CEO of ARM, the microprocessor company, and Rolls-Royce, where he is involved in many things, but in particular small nuclear reactors. And Warren is currently a non-exec at Tokamak, the fusion company, and also ASML, which is another microprocessor company. Currently president of the Institute of Engineering and Technology, and has a variety of other roles with the university. He is executive in residence at the Saïd Business School, and delightfully, he was given an honorary degree by Oxford University last summer.
Very nice.
And this is a particular interesting, well, delightful talk for us at the school, because for a long time we've been wanting to do things with the Saïd Business School, and it's never really quite happened. And this is going to be the first in a series of talks, probably one a term, that we're going to do. The Martin School, as many of you know, what our mission is to do solution-oriented research for the major problems of the 21st century. But for our research to mean anything, it actually has to translate into real companies and real implementation. So doing things with the business school is really important. The Dean of the Business School, Sumitra Dutta, is unable to be here today, although we'll be coming just afterwards. But I'm delighted that in his place, the Deputy Dean, Jonathan Reynolds, is here. Jonathan is not the Minister for...
no, I haven't got a northern accent, nor have I a beard.
So the current... what is his title? Minister for... Trade and Industry is also called Jonathan Reynolds, but this is the authentic Jonathan Reynolds we have here, who is Professor of Retail Marketing. So what we're going to do is Warren is going to talk for a little bit on some of the challenges and such, and then he's going to be in conversation with Jonathan about some of the issues that are raised, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. And then, as always with the Martin School, we finish promptly on time, so we'll be finishing at 6:15. So, Warren, thank you so much for coming, and over to you.
Good. Thank you very much. Now, I am going to come up with a few slides that I'm going to talk through, and really that is just setting some context. Most of the meat of this discussion is going to happen when Jonathan starts asking me questions, and then later when hopefully some people in the room are going to ask questions. But in order to give you some time to think of questions and also to set a little bit of context, I'm going to step through a handful of slides. Now, I'm here because the subject is how can innovation help address some of the challenges that we have in society in the 21st century. But I'm here because as an engineer and somebody who's worked in technologies of different varieties for a number of decades, then I'm an optimist fundamentally. I'm an optimist that engineering and technology can help us address some of these challenges, but I'm also a realist. And so I think it's important that we understand there are some challenges in addressing the challenges. And I'm going to use some examples from the energy transition space and from climate change mitigation, and so slightly tongue-in-cheek, I've used the term inconvenient truths to describe some of those challenges, addressing the challenges. Now, I'll start off by saying, so why do we appear to be facing lots of challenges in the 21st century? I'm sure people have faced challenges in every century that humankind has been around. But if I look back over the last 100 years, and I'm actually going to choose 75 years for reasons that might become apparent a little bit later, then one of the things I observe is that 75 years ago, in about 1950, then there were just over 2 billion people on the planet, about 2.5 billion people on the planet. And now there's somewhere in excess of 8 billion people on the planet in a relatively short period of time. And prior to that in history, if you go back another 100 years beyond 1950, you'll find that the population roughly doubled. But over the last 75 years, we've roughly, we've gone up by almost a factor of 4, which is a terrifying rate of growth, but perhaps that's the driving function for some of the challenges that we face today. Now, many of us could say, actually, that's fine. Generally, over the last 75 years, why are there 8 billion people? Well, far fewer people have been dying, so we've done a pretty good job on health. We've actually done a pretty good job on wealth. There remains a lot of inequality in the world, obviously, and that is one of the challenges. But we haven't done badly, so we could just sit and say, well, what is there to do? Why do we care about challenges of the 21st century? This is why I care. That's a picture of my daughter in the middle, and my daughter's in her early to mid 30s, and she has a young son. She has a young daughter as well, but she wasn't there that day. That's why I care. That's why I feel a sense of responsibility. It's a responsibility that we have to generations that are going to follow us. And that's why we should care about 21st century challenges. Those challenges, we can debate sort of what they are, but with 8 billion people on the planet, clearly food is an issue, water is an issue. Such a tiny proportion of the world's total water is available for people to use, and healthy water for drinking. Inequality is an issue, health I mentioned, and energy. And I'm going to talk a bit about energy, but before I get into that, let's just talk about the money. Because actually addressing some of these challenges is clearly going to cost. And where we are in Western democracies, we have governments that get elected, and they get elected with regularity, generally. And in order to get re-elected, our politicians have to promise us, the population, they have to promise us things, otherwise we'll elect the other guys. And so what tends to happen is that promises get made that can't really be kept. Promises get made that are a bit unrealistic, and a bit like parents promising things to children when they can't really deliver on those promises. Then financial challenges build up. And so, if we look at the last several decades, and this is how much debt has built up in key Western economies as a proportion of GDP. If you measure it in absolute terms, of course it goes up, but as a proportion of GDP, some of this growth in debt is terrifying. You wouldn't tolerate it as if it was happening to you personally, but collectively we seem to tolerate it just fine. But that means that we have a bit of a gap, because if we are going to address societal challenges in the 21st century that are going to cost a lot of money, well, we're doing it from a position where we're in a huge amount of debt. And that in and of itself is a big challenge. So what's going to help us address this challenge? I want to introduce a model. And I'm going to introduce a model now, which we can then use later on, perhaps in some of the discussion that we have. So here's a model, and it's about business. And I've chosen an engineering enterprise because I'm an engineer and scientist. And basically the business takes some science and does some engineering on it, and turns that science into products and services and sells those products and services to consumers at the end of the day, and the consumers pay for it, and the arrows go back in the other direction. So that's a very simple model of a business, and actually it isn't just engineering businesses, it's all sorts of businesses, same kind of concept. It isn't as simple as that. Often there is investment that goes into those companies, investment perhaps in ecosystem and infrastructure from governments, and investment from investors who are spending our money, our pension funds, investing in businesses. So that's taken the model to just sort of give a bit more awareness around it. Now, it is, however, important if we're going to solve societal problems and business is going to be a vehicle to help innovation and technology deliver those benefits to society, that the businesses make a profit. Because only when the businesses make a profit can they afford to deliver a return to the investors, so the investors can go around the loop and invest in the next lot of science and technology and deliver benefit to society. And the enterprise, its employees and everybody else, has to pay tax to the government so that the governments can distribute that tax to make society better. And some of that tax can be cycled round back into science, important in an academic environment where fundamental scientific research is being done, so that the cycle can repeat. Now, if my engineering tutor were here, he would say, well, Warren, draw the system. You're getting value out into a better society. Where's the value going into that system? And the value going into that system is in innovation. It's in creativity. And that creativity, which is human creativity, coming in either in the form of science and research and scientific development, or perhaps going into innovation within the business. So that's the model. And I would contend that the model, that should work and therefore help us take innovation and deliver benefit to society. In other words, address some of the societal challenges that we have in the 21st century. The problem is that the model's a little bit broken, and so subject for discussion later. I would contend that it's particularly broken around the pieces to the bottom of the slide, where we talk about investors and that cycle, risk-return profiles for investors, return and timing for investors, and so on. So now let's just take a few sort of examples. I talked about energy and climate change being one of 21st century big challenges. I think business is addressing this through transitioning from fossil fuels to other forms of energy, both energy storage and energy generation in the first place. That's not good enough for net zero. Topical today as the COP conference is going on in Central Asia at the moment. So climate change mitigation is something that we need to address because we can't just rely on an energy transition, because we've already built up too much damage to our atmosphere. So we need to basically do things like withdraw carbon dioxide. I put health up there. Health is another type of 21st century challenge. Now, I'm involved. As was mentioned, I'm a director on the board of Tokamak Energy. This is a fusion company. Nuclear fusion, when turning that into useful energy that we can use, has been a dream for decades. Great joke, it's 30 years away and it'll always be 30 years away. We were just talking earlier, I don't think that joke's so funny anymore, because I think we are that we are counting down the years. And at Tokamak Energy, they've made fantastic progress over the last 15 years or so that company has been in existence. And over the next 15 years or so, hopefully we'll get some delivery out of that. But the inconvenient truth, the challenge in addressing the challenge with that company is it takes 15 years, at least from here. And the investors that have been supporting that business for the last 15 years, they're entitled to feel a bit tired and run out of patience. And actually, there needs to be a lot more investment. So the way the business has to address that challenge is not wring its hands and whinge about the fact that the investors haven't got the appetite. It's, they haven't got the appetite, so we need to do something else. And the something else is taking some of the component technologies that exist today and trying to exploit them in other areas to generate revenue and present a different investment proposition, slightly changing that risk return thing which is broken in the model. Climate change mitigation. I'm also on the board of a carbon capture company, not a direct air capture company, but an industrial carbon capture company. And that company addresses things like the cement industry, the glass manufacture, things where actually as a society we kind of use cement and we use glass, and imagining getting by without it would be quite hard. But these processes generate carbon dioxide, even if we never burnt another fossil fuel at all between now and the future. That's also technology that takes quite a while to mature. It's technology that requires not single-digit millions of pounds to scale up and develop, but double and triple-digit millions of pounds to scale up and develop. And again, we have a challenge because investors don't necessarily have the appetite and investors aren't bad people, right? Investors are good people, but they haven't got the mandates to take that risk return balance and have the return over a long enough period of time. And so little companies like that teeter on the edge of insolvency, and that's how they exist. And that is a challenge because teetering on the edge, I'm conscious I'm standing on the back of this stage, and teetering on the edge is very easy to fall off. Health. Health isn't just about pharma. It's about all sorts of technology. And a good example that I've been learning about recently, a spin out from one of the, dare I say, Cambridge companies, is about democratizing really expensive healthcare, applying technology, reducing the cost by significant multiples, so that things like cell therapy, in this case, can be democratized. Innovation isn't just about the small companies that I've described. It's about large companies. And Charles mentioned my time at Rolls-Royce and SMRs. Well, Rolls-Royce has been developing nuclear reactors for decades and doing it very successfully and very safely in powering things like nuclear submarines. But actually, trying to make what appears to be a no-brainer in terms of taking that and putting it into a civil application to effectively do a sort of Henry Ford on nuclear reactors has been the devil's own job, and certainly outsaw my time at Rolls-Royce in terms of getting that off the ground and getting investment into it. So it's companies that are trying to reinvent themselves, and when that works, SMRs for Rolls-Royce will dwarf Rolls-Royce's existing business. That's the kind of scale of the thing. But innovation isn't just about small companies. Big companies have challenges as well. And when you come down to those challenges, it's often all about getting the people to move. And this we take a very, I'm here in Oxford and talking about UK examples. Things are different in different parts of the world. We all know that risk appetites in the US are very different. Actually, in some parts of the world, addressing some of these challenges is a lot easier. When you're not replacing existing infrastructure, when you're not trying to fit in with existing infrastructure, if you go to parts of the world where they don't have power networks, well, there isn't an existing infrastructure to fit into. When you go to a part of the world where the length of the day and the night is roughly the same, and the length and the amount of sunshine you get in the summer and the winter is roughly the same, then you don't have the storage problems that you have at these latitudes associated with things like solar technology. So perhaps it's horses for courses, and recognizing the fact that you have different solutions in different parts of the world. I would contend that these challenges, which can be addressed by technology, take zero carbon, for instance, we have all the technology we need. Notwithstanding, we need to do another 15 years of nuclear fusion technology maturing, but we can basically solve the challenges, and engineering can actually make it even better. But the challenge is making that business model work. And we can do it. I put on the bottom, necessity, the mother of invention, because I gave a talk about 2 years ago on this, and I highlighted the COVID example. You know, when we actually need to do something and break the rules, then we can break the rules. Now, just a little bit on a personal journey. I spent 30 years in the semiconductor world, as you just heard about. I've got these wafers on my room at home. These are silicon wafers. The bottom one is a 4-inch wafer with a 4-bit microprocessor on it, and that's a chip I worked on in the 1980s. And it has about 8,000 transistors on each chip the size of your fingernail. And the top wafer also has chips about the size of your fingernail. This is when I left ARM just over 10 years ago. Only there's 2.3 billion transistors on each chip the size of your fingernail. So in 30 years, we moved from 8,000 transistors to 2.3 billion. So innovation doesn't happen in a flash. You need to keep working on it, and it happens over an extended period of time. But I said I was an optimist. And before I left Rolls-Royce, we broke the speed record for electric flight. And my challenge to people looking forward, to the young engineers at Rolls-Royce looking forward, is, okay, so if that electric flight speed record plane is the small wafer on the bottom of the other side of the slide, in another 30 years, what does the carbon-free electric, or not necessarily electric, but the carbon-free aviation solution look like? And I think we've demonstrated that by continuing to work at these things, it can be done. So hopefully that's enough of a sort of context set for everybody. I'm now going to hand back to Jonathan, who's going to quiz me.
Absolutely. Can we flip back to that model, which I think is
yes.
we might use as a basis?
I'll put the model back up.
That's excellent.
Oh,
thank you.
there we go.
With the good bit at the top. Yes.
With the creativity.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Warren. That's fantastic context for a 25-minute conversation before we hand things over to the floor for questions. And I think it's a very timely conversation, as you suggested in your presentation. You set out a great model here. And if I was your tutor, I'd be saying, well, let's now unpack this and let's kick the tires and see what...
Live tutorial.
let's see what we can discover from looking at some of the building blocks in this model, because it's a very nice ecosystem. But of course, within it are very convoluted, as you suggested, and challenging and nuanced kind of considerations. I mean, the two areas that you focused on in your remarks were government and investors. And you suggested the model is broken in some way. If we focus on the UK initially, you know, where do we start? Let's start with investors. I mean, if we think about you know, the fact that the UK is ranked in the bottom 10% of OECD countries for investment intensity, for quite a number of years. And we've also been pretty poor at diffusing and adopting established novel technologies. You know, we were 5th in the Global Innovation Index, but only 31st in knowledge absorption in the last survey I saw. You know, what role do investors play in terms of their risk attitude, their approach to investment in these novel technologies in the UK context?
So I'm referring to investors here where, and what's missing off this model is a time axis. Right? So that engineering brackets productivity block is where we're basically taking some underlying science, doing some engineering work on it, creating something which I might call technology, and then doing some more engineering on that technology to turn it into products and services. And now, if I'm, I don't know, a consumer of an ARM microprocessor, say even an NVIDIA, then to develop my next generation of AI chip might take me 2, 3, 4 years. To take something like the carbon capture technology I talked about, well, we're probably talking of 8 years plus. And typically a lot of that technology is in small businesses, and so the quantums involved in terms of investment are relatively small. But there's a long period of patience required, because there's a promise, but the promise doesn't materialize in terms of making the top bit of the chart work with customers paying money and earning revenue for many years. So the timing between the investment and the return is too long. Also, we find that investors that want to invest in, say, climate change mitigation technologies, quite often they're sort of infrastructure type investors, where the infrastructure fund has been dressed up as something that's a green fund. And this stuff's risky, and infrastructure is a lot less risky. So the risk profile is wrong. So you've got the timing and you've got the risk. And finally, there's a third factor, which is the scale of the activity. Quite often, these innovations are with small businesses, and so the sums involved are relatively small. And if you're a fund and you've raised $7 billion or something, then and I come to you and say, please, will you invest £10 million? Well, it doesn't actually move the needle. However good a return they're going to make on their £10 million, however many years down the road, it's not going to make much of an impact on the 7 billion and the type of return they have to make on the 7 billion. So they have to invest in tons of 10 million enterprises, but they don't. They need to invest in bigger chunks. And those bigger chunks are not where the type of technology sits.
So how do we go about educating investors of the right way to proceed?
I think we actually need to get behind the investors, and we need to educate the investors' investors. So, it's very interesting here in the UK at the moment. The new government is banging small pension funds together, or smaller pension funds together, because they observe that in Canada they have great big pension funds, and the Canadian pension funds seem to invest in this stuff for a long period of time. Well, you need to do more than just bang the small funds together. You need to change the mandate so that people are, a portion. And I'm not saying we need to sort of go taking humongous risks with everybody's pension, because as individuals, we invest and we want to see a return. But actually, a portion of that needs to be invested in a slightly riskier way. So it's actually the mandates that need to change, not, we don't need, the investors understand this perfectly. There's no education required there, but it's education in terms of who's delivering the mandates.
Yeah. Well, I'm in the USS, I probably shouldn't comment too much about risk profiles on pension funds. But the other aspect of investment is a comment you made, I think, in a different forum. You were quite critical of the ability of the UK to get commercialisation right. You said too much innovation gets created in the UK, but is then exported elsewhere around the world. Do you think this applies to the technologies that you're particularly focusing on this evening?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I think there is a cultural issue, and I think some of those mandates are better in other parts of the world. Silicon Valley's well known for it, and there is just a cultural difference. You wander around San Francisco or wander around the city of London, and it kind of feels different. That's well documented. That means that companies are, they have a hard choice. And I've been asked in the Saïd Business School actually when talking about US and UK and the subject, because these MBA types at the Saïd are very interested in their careers and furthering their careers,
sure.
and they talked about as a CEO in the UK you can earn this much, and as a CEO in America you can earn this much, and I did spend some time on a remuneration committee for a US company once upon a time. I couldn't believe it, but my answer to that individual was, well, that's fine, but I'm not just motivated by the reward. Now, we do have some great technology here in the UK, and it's just not right if that doesn't get exploited and we don't try. We shouldn't give up before we even start, and so that's why I put effort into exploiting technology in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, are there some other UK specific factors, do you think, that hold us back? You particularly were talking about country markets with existing infrastructure being a challenge in terms of types of investment, legacy.
I don't think we are unique in the UK. I mean, we've just been talking about the US. Well, if you travel on trains in the US, or if you drive around New York and negotiate your way around the potholes, then infrastructure expenditure isn't or challenge of infrastructure expenditure isn't a problem, which is unique to the UK. But I do think there's something. What's behind that? Well, it's perhaps what I was hinting at in terms of governments promising a lot and then finding that they need to spend on those promises rather than perhaps spend on some of the infrastructure.
Yet other governments manage to do this. So what is it about UK government?
Well, actually, they don't all manage to do it. If you go to Germany, you find that the rate of replacement of grid technology there, the amount of capex that gets spent on replacing the grid can barely keep up with replacing or maintaining what's there, let alone invest in what's required for the future.
We're too focused on sort of UK exceptionalism in the wrong way.
Yes, I mean, we happen to be in the UK, and so I quote some UK examples because I happen to work here. But certainly in my time at Rolls-Royce, I've observed very similar behaviour in other parts of the world.
Yeah. Now, your involvement with carbon capture was also really interesting, I think, and the role you're now playing within sea capture. I was reading an FT article about this earlier in the year, and it was saying that you were saying that you want to devote much of the rest of your career to tackling climate change and the energy transition. What does that period look like? What are the actions you think are going to need to be taken? What's your role in that? What's your manifesto, if you like?
Okay, so I suppose it's grabbing opportunities like this to talk about the challenges, to hopefully do some educating about what it's like at the coalface. I mean, sea capture is an interesting example, and I talked about teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Well, there's a business with some great technology, might well not exist by Easter. And that would be a great shame for that particular business. What would be even more of a shame is if that technology withered on the vine along with the business. And so my goal is to try to make sure that doesn't happen, and that's the kind of manifesto, I suppose. It's saying, no, we have got some great technology, we've got some great science, we've got some great creativity. I want to make that model work. and I want, I'm highlighting a couple of issues with the model, but fundamentally, it should work.
So let's look at government then, and we've seen I have it here. The new green paper. Very worthy words on industrial strategy, Invest 2035, which is certainly beyond the lifetime of the current government, so at least they're thinking further ahead. So let's think a little bit about some of the policies within that and that have already been action, like Great British Energy, for example, which talks about public-private partnerships. We haven't got a great track record of success with PPPs in this country, it seems to me. You might want to disagree and give me some counterexamples. But if we're going to be using these kinds of partnerships to perhaps break the deadlock between the two stakeholder groups, do you think PPPs are going to be worthwhile in the energy sector?
Well, I do think that's the right way of doing it. I put the two blocks there rather than just put government or just put investors, because I do think it takes both. And some of the role of government is it's about policy and framework. I've described it before as like the lubricant that sort of oils the machine.
But isn't government just good at saying no rather than facilitating?
Well, I think we do have a little bit of prevarication. It's great to see things like 2035 because as you say, it signals an intent. But actually, there does need to be more than the fancy words. One of the flip side of this is that come the next government, this just ends up in the heap because actually we've changed our minds. Great British Energy was a nice idea, but actually we've got a new shiny idea, and it's very frustrating for the people that work in those sorts of organisations. Sometimes they're people who've worked in industry and they want to give something back, and they move into organisations like that, and they just get stuck in the treacle, where there's process for process sake, and it's very difficult to get people moving.
So this is a cultural issue as well.
Well, but that is sort of why you need the investor bit to provide the pressure, because investors do have to deliver a return to their investors, and so they are motivated to make it work.
Yeah, this is a consultation. I mean, and in fairness to the document, my namesake in the Department of Industry sort of has actually said, we want this to be a lasting document. This is too often, as you've just said, there's this kind of turnover of governments and policies, and this will get chucked in the bin, and there'll be something else in its place. How do you get a persistent kind of can-do attitude within government for this? How do you get that arrow working effectively to influence governmental processes, to get people to see things how they really are, and to create actionable policies?
I wish I knew the answer, because if I
didn't
know the answer, we wouldn't be having the discussion. But I do think there are examples, and I threw down as a sort of slightly provocative comment on the bottom of one of the slides that when necessity is the mother of invention, action does happen.
But sometimes we revert to character afterwards. So actually, it still takes a long time to get vaccines approved.
Yes. And the challenge we have, or the societal challenge around climate change, is one where I'm imagining that the stakes are just going to continue to increase, and so necessity probably will be the mother of invention. We just have to hope that
it happens in time for it to be.
The billions of people that might need to move around the world don't have to move around the world.
Yeah. We've talked a bit about carbon capture. Can we give you some examples of what you see as other leading candidate novel technologies? And the one I have in mind, for example, is small modular reactors. That's just something I have a particular interest in.
So I've got two interests in small nuclear reactors, and so if we're talking about making our energy system carbon free, then we have renewables, and I said we've got lots of technology available, but it is well known that you can have all the solar panels you want, but doing things like in these sorts of latitudes, dealing with, today it's pitch black out there and it's 20 to 6. In the winter, our days at this sort of latitude are half the length that they are in the summer. So you can have batteries, and I'm involved in a solar farm. It's about a 60 megawatt solar farm. And the company that's operating that is talking about battery storage. Great, battery storage. They're putting in 2 hours worth of storage so they can trade. That's not really storing energy from, a sunny day to a less sunny day. It certainly, doesn't even scrape the surface in terms of seasonal storage. You need other means of storage besides batteries, or you need, and this isn't surprising, you need a collection of different technologies. France does a good job on powering a lot of its electrical needs with nuclear reactors. We do a bit less of that here in the UK. We could do more of that here in the UK. I think nuclear has to be part of the mix because of the issues around storage with renewable systems. And that's where the interest in nuclear comes, because we can't do the whole thing with renewables. However, big nuclear projects are mired with that making that model work around a large nuclear project is really difficult. Typically the costs escalate and multiply, and perhaps as much as 40-50% of the cost of building one of these large nuclear reactors turns out to be financing cost. And if you imagine a project which set out to be a 10-year project and ended up as a 15-17-year project, then you've got a standing army of people. So the costs bound to go up, even before you bring in the inflationary effects on the cost of materials and so on. So the idea about the small modular reactors is to say, well, we can do this more cheaply. Instead of having a project and always be doing first of a kind, we can create a product. And so this is a bit like, I use the term Henry Ford. This is like Henry Ford democratizing automobiles in the early part of the 20th century by doing factory build and saying you have to make some compromises over it. No, you can't have different colors and different sizes. A Rolls-Royce SMR is 470 megawatts. That's it. If you want a 500 megawatt one, well, you can't. Because if we have to do customized versions for everybody, then the costs are just not going to deliver. So that's the kind of premise, that's a type of project, that's a type of technology. It's needed. People say, oh, but what about the waste? We should have fusion. Well, we should have fusion, and in due course we will have fusion. But in the meantime, we can't wait for that to happen. We need something like fission, even if it is a transition technology. It's a transition technology for several decades, because we just can't have fusion that quickly. And then even if we waved a magic wand and we had, the first fusion out of tokamak energy tomorrow, it's still going to be decades before you can roll those things out in any scale around the world. And in the meantime, we can't keep relying on fossil fuel.
Yeah. I'm going to hand back to Charles in a second to do some Q&A from the audience, but I had a final question for you. Sea Capture was a spin out from University of Leeds, as I recall.
Correct.
And so what advice would you have for research intensive universities like Oxford to play in supporting your thesis? Clearly, universities don't appear specifically on your model, but I can see them in the top left-hand corner, but I can see them throughout in terms of educating and raising awareness and things to do with business school, leadership transformation of organizations and so on, thinking about different organizational cultures. But what are the priorities for research-intensive universities in this manifesto, this approach to thinking through innovation?
I just put it as two, really. I think concentrating on relevant technologies in the top left-hand corner and the left-hand side of the chart. But I'd also say engagement within the business piece. And that's realistic engagement. Sometimes there is a misunderstanding about the value. Now, the value originally comes from creativity and the science, but that creativity, there's a green arrow deliberately going into the engineering enterprise, so that a chunk of the value that I said the system, there has to be value going in somewhere. It goes into the engineering enterprise, and one of the issues with universities is, and I haven't illustrated it very well with this chart, I do admit, but the little green arrow from create down into science is meant to be quite a lot smaller than the green arrow from create into the engineering enterprise. And when a university spins out some technology and says, oh, well, we want this much ownership for the technology, they're really underestimating the amount of value that gets added to turn that technology into products and services. So sometimes the things like the royalties that are expected by university spin-out machines, and you can't blame the people. They're measured on how much return they can make. They're just unrealistic. And my time at ARM and interfacing with Cambridge University, at any rate, was I think they got a lot more real, and well-known investor in Cambridge, Herman Hauser, was right out on a limb saying, no, the university is completely unrealistic. They're an order of magnitude out in terms of the reward that they want for the underlying technology, because so much of the value gets added by the business.
Very good. Thank you, Warren. I'm going to pass back to Charles to
thank you very much. So
the questions.
We're going to move to questions, and if you could wait until a microphone comes. And our normal warning is that this is being live streamed, so, which you might bear in mind if you told your boss that you're doing something else at the time. I'm going to usurp my position by asking Warren the first question. We've seen, especially in the States, that a number of the big tech platforms have invested in nuclear, including in small modular reactors, and also, though I think it's fallen through, in a conventional nuclear in 3 Mile Island. And of course, we don't have that in this country, but do you think that, and they're driven by trying to get to net zero themselves, do you think this is going to be a good thing for moving the technology forward?
Yes, I do. I think this is an example of, well, it's a combination of government policy. So those businesses are encouraged to make their energy consumption net zero, or get to net zero and beyond if possible. But it's also a little bit, necessity is the mother of invention. Data centers, we've been predicting for, certainly I started getting involved in this in about 2008, when we decided strategically ARM needed to get into data centers, and the hook that we used was, well, energy. These things are going to use tons of energy. In 2008 they used a lot of energy, and we knew that it was just going to increase. And AI has provided a tremendous boost to that. Statistic 2022 worldwide data center energy consumption was roughly the size of UK energy consumption. And by 2026 it will have more than doubled. Now, these are just massive chunks of energy, and the companies that are operating these data centers, they used to buy things like backup power supplies from Rolls-Royce, and that was a great market for us. But the reality is that the numbers are just getting very large, and they need to take control of their own destiny. And so that little bit of necessity being the mother of invention is also driving it, I think.
And I was also very struck that you said that in one sense it's a no-brainer to take the nuclear technology that's used in submarines and make it civil. And then I think you said you had the devil's own job of actually getting it to work. Could you tell
No, not getting it to work.
I know, getting it to... So could you flesh out a little bit some of the challenges that?
Well, I think some of the challenges we found there were, very encouraging signs from government at sort of top level. These are big plays. Even a small modular reactor. I mean, a Rolls-Royce small modular reactor, first of a kind, is like 4 or 5 billion pounds. Nth of a kind, maybe 2 billion pounds. They're big sums of money, and when you get into big sums of money like that, you can't necessarily just rely on investors. You need a little bit of government push. When we get into things like energy and nuclear, we do have a sort of national security overlay, and so it is reasonable to expect government to play some role in that. But certainly by the time I left Rolls-Royce, we hadn't actually got any commitment out of the UK government. Rolls is now ahead in terms of the competition that UK government is running around small modular reactors, perhaps 18 months ahead of the nearest competitor. But this is about the 5th or 6th competition that has happened. And it seems like every competition, we need to run another competition. Because we're sort of kicking the can down the road and not making decisions. Now, the new government hasn't had a chance yet, so let's give it a chance. But I don't think that type of behaviour was unique to the last government.
Thank you very much. Questions, Alex? And I should also say, for those who are online, do feel free to post a question, because they'll come to me here. Alex.
So this is great. Thanks for your talk. I really loved it. On the issue of nuclear, etc., something like 80% of the renewables going forward in the UK are probably going to be wind rather than solar. But either way, there's the intermittency issue with both of these. And you can't switch nuclear reactors on and off that easily, I wouldn't have thought. So, and also, Crystal Llewellyn-Smith did a report for the Royal Society fairly recently on energy storage. Big report, took several years to write, where they showed that actually from Met Office records, there's like 3 years around 2011 when the wind goes right down. And so we can't really rely necessarily on the same levels of wind going forward. So he proposed, or his team proposed, that what we need is hydrogen storage. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this, because it would be a massive shake-up in terms of our attitude to intermittency and switching to renewables.
So hopefully everybody heard the question around using hydrogen as a form of storing energy. And I completely agree with them. I think digging holes in mountains for hydro storage is, we haven't got the geography for it. There are some parts of the world, Norway for instance, where they do very well in terms of hydro, and that's great. If you've got that sort of geography, use it. But if you haven't got that sort of geography, then you need to find something else. And classic battery technology ain't going to do it in terms of scale, cost, access to materials and the like. So absolutely, I believe in hydrogen. Now, the challenge that some people talk about with hydrogen is, it's inefficient because, you're as good as you can get with your electrolyzer, then, maybe 70%. As good as you can get with your fuel cell, maybe 70%. So the cycle is less than 50% efficient. Well, it's inefficient. Well, goodness me, how efficient is a solar panel? The reality is with that hydrogen cycle, 50% is better than no percent. Significantly better than no percent, and so I would absolutely agree with that recommendation, and I think we need to scale it and use it, because I don't really see another alternative. Bringing nuclear into the mix means that we have to do less of the storage. And for me, that seems like common sense. It's building resilience into the system, because if you've got all your chips on one thing, then when it goes wrong, and these things, will go wrong, you will run into a 3-year period when there's no wind. Then you need to have some resilience in the total system, and so I absolutely agree with the recommendation of that report.
Thank you. I should have asked people to introduce themselves, and that is, of course, Alex Halliday from Columbia and Oxford. Question right at the back.
Well, first of all, thank you for your time. I'm Carlos Araujo. I'm an MBA student at Saïd. In developing nations such as Mexico, where there is no regulation pushing for energy transition, where the energy grid is in a very lukewarm position in terms of emissions, and many companies are relying on their exports to Europe or the US, for example, how would you, as an executive, manage the shareholders to convince them or to invest in these energy transition technologies? So given the pressure that you as a CEO may have from these groups to keep up the promises for 2030 that other of your vendors or your clients have made, so you will stay in business with them?
Okay, I think I'm interpreting the question as there's a business in a value chain, and in some countries there are mandates and encouragement to achieve a certain level of carbon reduction across your value chain. Those companies in the value chain maybe in other countries which don't have those issues. So I got a supplier and they perhaps don't care about their emissions, but I'm using that supplier and I'm bound to achieve scope 3 emissions of a certain level. Have I interpreted the question correctly?
Yes, but in the case you were the supplier in the supply chain, so...
Okay, well, it doesn't really matter if I'm their supplier or they're my supplier. The issue is there's a difference in our approach to scope 3. If I'm their supplier and they have a choice to go to another supplier that doesn't care, and it costs me to do things in a different way and meet my emission ambitions, then that is a challenging position, because they may well be just economically minded. And there it's a question of talking about long term, talking about being established, talking about how much we can teach our customer going forward, because actually the regulations are going to catch up with them eventually, because this isn't a national issue, this is a global issue. And countries, all around the world are getting there. That's why there's a bunch of people in Azerbaijan at the moment, at a COP conference. It does happen around the world. In the short term, I may well lose that piece of business. And actually, there's not much I can do about that. If they want to make a short-term economic decision, then they will. I'll do my damnedest to persuade them that a long-term approach is better for them in the long term economically, but I might not be able to win that argument.
Thank you. We have another question at the back and then a couple at the front.
Thank you. Miklos Lazar, DPIR. I'd like to ask you about 3 connected items, and maybe you could respond to the ones that you...
Sorry, a little bit louder, please.
Yes, yeah. I have 3 points, and you're welcome to respond to all of them, or just a couple.
Actually, I'm going to ask you just to pick one point.
They are the same point, essentially, just 3. So essentially, when you're thinking about the competitiveness of the UK economy and how you encourage innovation, there's 3 things that stand out to me. One of them is the automation of investments, especially small-scale investments. Do you think the UK is doing enough in that space? The second thing is the entrepreneurial culture. We seem to have less of an ethos here for entrepreneurship than some parts of the US, for instance. What is your take on that? How can that be encouraged, and what can universities do, for instance? And the third thing, you mentioned, of course, the reduction of the spin-out cuts. Do you think that's enough, or is there something else that university innovation offices can do? Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I'm afraid I can't really speak to automation in investment because I'm not an investor. I don't really understand how. I can imagine sort of screening investments and using technology to screen investments, but I can't tell you whether that should be used more or should be used less. In terms of what we can do to encourage entrepreneurship, then I think we need to do this sort of thing. I think universities need to start educating. When I did engineering, there was a course that ran alongside the Oxford course called Engineering, Economics and Management. And at the time, Oxford was quite a pioneer in terms of saying, well, lots of these engineers are going to sort of exploit their engineering in business, so we need to teach them a bit about it. Now there's a lot more of that around. But I would go further, and I would also say to our colleagues who aren't doing engineering, who are doing perhaps art subjects, that actually it's great, and we do need we need lawyers, of course we need lawyers, and we need retailers, but we need people in business. And so I think teaching about the benefits of business and how business delivers benefit to society we just need to do more of that. And actually it will help universities as well. US universities are much better funded than UK universities because they quite often have some very rich alumni that give them lots of money. We don't, because we don't have so many rich billionaires in the UK. But if we encouraged more entrepreneurship in our universities, we'd have richer alumni, and that would make the universities better. So, I do think that probably it was a loaded question. I do think you're right. We need to put some effort in there. I'll just answer the two because I know you need to move on.
Well, I'll just inject a question from online which is related to that. Have we the right incentives for university research to produce more of the research that can then be taken up by industry? I'm actually not sure how you incentivize it. Maybe it's in the allocate. That's a capital allocation question for the universities. And we were talking a little bit earlier ahead of this talk. We were talking in a room over there, and I mentioned to you my experience at ARM, where in the world of semiconductors, I found a lot of university collaborations were stuck either around technology that was so ancient that we wouldn't really have an interest in it as ARM, or technology that was so immature and so way out in the future that we wouldn't really have an interest in it in ARM. And so I think probably a little bit of loading and steering and encouraging universities to basically allocate capital, intellectual capital and financial capital into that middle bit is probably a good thing. Thank you. That question was from Michelle Dubarry. Jim.
So my name is Jim Naismith. I'm the head of MPLS division. So I picked up your message, and hopefully it was heard around the room, that universities have to be realistic about their return on their IP. This is a perennial problem. But I was going to ask you a second thing. Given the scale and the challenge of the energy transition, where do you think the university sectors have to, or can they avoid engagement with the at-scale majors in the energy business?
I don't think they should avoid engagement with that scale, but I think they need to look across the piece and say, a lot of innovation happens in the smaller enterprises, and the bigger enterprises don't necessarily, it's a bit like when I talked about the developing world not having the infrastructure and therefore you don't have to fit into the infrastructure. In a large established company, it is harder to do new innovative work, because particularly if it's a listed company, you've got to deliver next quarter and you've got to deliver the quarter after that and so on. Whereas in a smaller company, your very existence depends on progressing your technology. So universities are going to need to interact with both, because you need the innovation in the smaller company. You need and I pointed out, you get sort of reinvention in larger companies as well, but you also need the scale of larger companies to sort of implement and roll out. And that's why you take a business like Sea Capture, for instance, and an ideal model there would not be for Sea Capture to get gazillions of pounds to invest in a load of metal work, but that's an obvious example where you would think about licensing technology into multiple verticals, where actually the large established companies deploy that technology, and universities need to work across both. Thank you.
Olga Kozlova, Director of Innovation and Engagement at the university. My question is about, when you talked a lot about differences in the UK and in US Silicon Valley. So in the UK, we're quite good in starting startups. We are not as good at scaling and growing companies. You alluded to one of the reasons, it's availability of capital. Another one is quite often availability of talent, people with expertise who actually can scale this company. So it's almost sometimes seen as inevitable that companies will be sold and will move on to enable this cycle to go in. However, my question is about what can universities and the government do to retain at least some presence in the UK? Obviously, ARM is an example where there is a kind of retention in the UK, but what in general do you think we can do so when the company, even when it is sold, it doesn't completely leave the UK, but actually we retain some base here?
Well, I think one change you could make is, you said we have a challenge with capital and we also have a challenge with skill. I don't think we have a challenge with skill. I think we have plenty of capability here in the UK, and in my experience at Rolls-Royce, we have engineers that are absolutely capable of going toe-to-toe with their counterparts in well-known US companies, and similarly with ARM. I think if we tell ourselves that we haven't got the skill, then we won't have the skill. But if we accept the fact that maybe some of these younger people in the room and younger people out in those businesses, okay, maybe they haven't scaled large companies, but neither did the people who were scaling the large companies in America. When they did it for the first time, they hadn't done it before either. So I sort of say, actually, we need to bet on some of these people in the UK, rather than just assume that we haven't got the skills. And that would be one thing that we could do to remove one of the barriers that you mentioned. Now, how could we improve our chances with those people? Well, it's back to the question about education and entrepreneurship and getting people tuned into business, rather than perhaps pursuing some other careers.
Thank you. We're coming to the end, but I want to try and get in 2 questions. Please be brief.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Emeka. I'm doing a DPhil in engineering sciences, also working on energy transition, but in Africa. So you did mention something about the semiconductors, and I really like the example, but I just wanted to ask if you thought that analogy between semiconductors and then electric sort of flights or zero emission flights was kind of equivalent, given the sort of fundamental difference in the physics of both. Are we ever going to achieve that kind of scale in terms of the improvement? And then if not, why, from your experience, haven't worked with some of these really big sort of bodies like Rolls-Royce, SMR, etc., do investors tend to just kind of insist on certain technologies, for instance, nuclear fusion, for instance. Again, the physics of it is very, very difficult. It's not going to happen in like tomorrow or a day after tomorrow. Meanwhile, we have other sort of low barrier technologies that they just don't want to listen to because FT, Guardian, ETC will not write on those, but they just want the things that they will invest in, and then their names go in as, oh, we've put in 1 billion investment into XYZ technology. Isn't that a thing of like a tragedy of the commons, or what's sort of your experience in this?
Thanks so much.
Okay. Well, I stand by the example of the aviation piece. Actually, the timeline that I was talking about for the semiconductors and making that change was about 30 years. If I look at aviation, slightly longer timeline, but if I go back to about 1947, which is roughly the time of it is the time of the first transistor, then it used to take about 4 days to travel between Sydney and London by aeroplane, and it took humongous quantities of energy because the engines were inefficient. They could only fly short distances. People had to sort of stay places and so on. And now you can do it in about 21 hours, and that's sort of continuous improvement. So although you won't necessarily map completely one-to-one, my point was, you need to keep working at this, because actually if you don't, then you won't make improvement, and there is continuous improvement to be had in other sectors. I'm terribly sorry, I've sort of slightly forgotten the thread of your second question. Did you remember?
Low barrier entry technologies like SMRs that actually get more bullish and achieve a much quicker transition while also preparing for the future.
Yeah, right, okay, fine. Well, I guess that's really a question to ask the investors. And in my experience, they're not particularly only interested in fashion. Investors are interested in making a return and are interested in supporting things like SMRs as well as fusion. So I think maybe there is a bit of fashion around, and you can see it in things like inflated share prices around Nvidia's share price at the moment because of AI. You do go through these hype cycles, but in terms of investors investing at earlier stages in the development of technology, then I think it is a bit less fashionable than you might imagine. But if there are some investors in the room that want to contribute, then please do.
So with apologies to people who wanted to ask questions, I'm afraid we have run out of time. And just before thanking Warren, 2 brief announcements. We actually have another talk tomorrow by Sergio Guriev, who's the incoming new head of the London Business School, on fighting information on social media. And as I said, this is the first of what is going to be a series of talks between Saïd and the Martin School. It's been a pleasure working with Jonathan on this. And do look out, we'll be making the announcement of the next one, which will be after Christmas. And finally, Warren, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And I do like your optimism without shying away from any of the challenges. And yes, of course, money is important, but what I got is, we need a different culture. We need a different way of looking at these challenges. And I think you're going to be one of the people who engineer this. So please join me in thanking Warren for a really fascinating talk. Thank you.